The morning Virginia Rhodes drove a wooden stake into the sun-cracked earth of Cimarron Flats. She did it with the kind of fury that only comes from having nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas prairie stretched out before her like a vast amber ocean frozen mid-wave. The grasses bent low by a wind that smelled of coming rain and old promises. Virginia was 32 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to her husband, and eyes the color of sage after a thunderstorm. A deep, complicated green that shifted depending on how the light hit them. She was not a delicate woman, not in the way that word was commonly meant out on the frontier. She was lean and capable, with hands that told the truth of her life more honestly than any words she might have spoken. There were calluses on her palms from years of hauling water, mending fence, and doing every task that two people were supposed to share. Her husband, Elias Rhodes, had died 14 months ago. A fever had taken him in the span of 4 days, leaving Virginia with 2 children, a half-built farmstead on the edge of what the county land office had registered as 160 acres under the Homestead Act of 1862. She had a cow that was more stubbornness than milk, a small herd of 12 sheep, a kitchen garden that was fighting the drought as hard as she was, and a deed that 3 men in the territory suddenly seemed to believe did not mean what it plainly said. The dispute had started 6 weeks after Elias died, when a rider from the Beaumont Cattle Company had appeared at her door with a folded letter and a hat he did not remove. The letter suggested, in language that was polite in the way that a knife hidden behind a man's back is polite, that her claim on the southeastern quarter of Section 14 was overlapping with grazing rights the Beaumont Company had held since 1874. The writer had said it would be best for everyone if she considered relocating before the summer drives began. Virginia had taken the letter, read it twice, folded it carefully, and told the writer he could tell whoever sent him that she had read the filing herself and that her claim was lawful and registered, and that she intended to remain. The second letter had been less polite. The third had not been a letter at all but a fence line that appeared overnight along what she believed was her eastern boundary, pushing the marker 50 yards into what she was certain was her land. She had pulled that fence down herself, post by post, in the August heat, with her daughter Nell watching wide-eyed from the porch and her son Daniel trying to help with a determination that broke her heart a little, because he was only 9 years old and already learning that the world was not always fair. Now it was April of 1878, and she had ridden into the county seat at Caldwell and spoken to the land office clerk for the 3rd time, and the clerk had told her again, with that particular kind of sympathy that costs nothing and does nothing, that the matter was complicated because of competing claims, and that she might want to consult a lawyer if she wished to press it. The nearest lawyer who was not already on retainer to one of the large cattle concerns was in Wichita, 60 miles east, and that might as well have been the moon for all the practical difference it made. So Virginia Rhodes had come home, and she had taken the sharpest stake she could fashion from the remains of the old corral post, and she had driven it into the earth at the exact point where the land office survey said her eastern boundary line began, and she had tied to it a strip of red calico torn from a dress she no longer wore, and she had stood back and looked at it snapping in the Kansas wind, and something inside her chest had settled into a hard, clean resolve. The flag, and that is what it was, as surely as any flag ever planted on any hill by any soldier, said without words, "I am here. This is mine. I am not leaving." She did not know, standing there with the wind pulling at her hair and the spring sun warm on her face, that a rider had already crested the low ridge to the north and was watching her. Nathan Covington had been riding for 3 days, and he was tired in the deep way that settles into a man's bones when he has been sleeping on hard ground and eating cold biscuits and thinking too hard about things he cannot resolve. He was 36 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had grown a little too long over the winter and a jaw that had not seen a proper razor in 4 days. He had gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over a flat country, and a way of going still when he was thinking that some people mistook for blankness, but was in fact the opposite. He had ridden for the Beaumont Cattle Company for 7 years. He was their best cattle manager, not a hired enforcer, not a man who made trouble, but a man who solved problems and moved cattle and kept things running. He was good at his work, and he was well paid for it, and he had not asked too many questions about the methods that the company's owner, Harlan Beaumont, used to manage the territory the way a chess player manages a board. He had been sent to Cimarron Flats to resolve the matter of the Rhodes claim. Those were the words Beaumont had used. Resolve the matter. Nathan had asked what that meant, and Beaumont had told him it meant convincing the woman to sell or move on, and that he should be persuasive. Nathan had asked what happened if she refused, and Beaumont had said he trusted Nathan to use good judgment. Nathan had ridden north from the company's winter camp knowing that good judgment was exactly what he intended to use, and suspecting that it might not be the kind Beaumont had in mind. He sat on his horse, a big, patient roan named Calhoun, and watched the woman in the battered hat drive her stake and tie her red cloth to it, and something about the sight of it stopped him in a way he had not expected. There was nothing theatrical about what she was doing. It was not a performance. It was a woman staking a claim on what was hers, alone on a wide, empty prairie, with nobody watching, or so she thought. The simplicity of it, the pure stubbornness of it, moved him in a way he could not immediately name. He rode down off the ridge slowly, not wanting to startle her. Virginia heard the hoofbeats and turned before he was halfway down the slope. She did not step back. She stood next to her stake with her arms at her sides and watched him come, and when he pulled Calhoun to a stop 15 feet away, she looked at him with those complicated green eyes and said, "If Harlan Beaumont sent you, you can turn around." Nathan took off his hat. It was a reflex, the way a man raised to have manners removes his hat when addressing a woman, and he was not even aware he had done it until he felt the wind on his hair. "He did send me," Nathan said. "My name is Nathan Covington. I manage the cattle operations for the Beaumont Company." "I know who you are," Virginia said, which surprised him. "Your name was on one of the letters." He had not known that. He had not seen the letters Beaumont sent. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I came out here to talk to you about the property line." "Then you have had a wasted ride," Virginia said. "I talked to the land office in Caldwell 3 times. My claim is registered and lawful. That stake marks my eastern boundary as it is recorded in the survey. If the Beaumont Company has cattle grazing on the other side of that line, they are grazing on my land, and I am asking them to stop." Nathan looked at the stake, at the red calico snapping in the wind, and then back at the woman. He had spent 3 days in the saddle preparing arguments about grazing rights and prior use, and the practicalities of the summer cattle drive. All of them dissolved in the face of her clear, direct statement. "Can I get down?" he asked. Virginia studied him for a moment. "You can get down," she said. "I will not shoot a man who is getting off his horse." There was something dry in the way she said it that might, in a different context, have been a kind of humor. Nathan swung down from Calhoun and stood holding the reins, and now they were on level ground and he could see her more clearly. The lines around her eyes spoke of squinting into prairie sun and of grief that had been lived through rather than simply endured. There were wisps of auburn hair escaping her hat in the wind. She was watching him with an intelligence that made him feel he should choose his words carefully. "I have not seen the Beaumont Company's survey," he said. "I have only seen mine." "Then I would like to see yours," Virginia said without moving. "I can get it." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded document. He walked toward her slowly and held it out. She took it, unfolded it, and looked at it for a long time. He watched her face. "This survey is from 1874, she said. "Yes. Mine is from 1876. The land office resurveyed this section after the settlement claims were filed. I did not know that, Nathan said. And the thing was, he was telling the truth, and he knew by the way she looked up at him that she was trying to decide whether that was true. There is a difference of 42 yards along this eastern line, Virginia said. Your survey puts your grazing boundary 42 yards into my claim. Nathan looked at the survey and then looked at the stake in the ground. He was good with numbers and distances, and he could see immediately that she was right. The discrepancy was there in the paper he was holding. I need to get a look at your filing, he said. Virginia folded his survey precisely and held it out to him. Come up to the house, she said after a moment. You can look at what I have. The house was a small, solid structure of sod and rough-cut timber, the kind of home that the Prairie built out of necessity and stubbornness. It had a covered porch that faced south, and there was a kitchen garden to the west of it, recently turned and showing the first thin green lines of spring seedlings. A cow regarded him suspiciously from the small corral. From behind the house, he could hear the sound of children's voices. Virginia led him inside without fanfare. The interior was clean in the way that speaks of constant effort in difficult circumstances. The earthen floor was swept. The one glass window was clean. There was a table with 2 chairs and a rocking chair near the hearth, and there were small things on the walls that spoke of a life lived with care. A pressed flower in a wooden frame. A child's drawing tacked to the wood plank above the fireplace. A calendar from 1877 with dates carefully marked. She went to a wooden chest and opened it and brought out a tin box. From the tin box she produced a document and laid it on the table. Nathan sat down, only after she gave him the smallest nod to indicate he could, and read the land office filing for Virginia Rhodes, registered November 14, 1876. The survey numbers were different from his company's document. The eastern boundary line was 42 yards east of where the older document placed it. He sat with the paper in his hands for a long moment. You are right, he said. Virginia had been standing with her arms crossed, watching him read. Something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. I know I am right, she said. I have known I was right for over a year. Knowing you are right and having that mean anything are 2 different problems when the other party is Harlan Beaumont. Nathan put the document down carefully. Mrs. Rhodes, he said, I am going to be honest with you. Beaumont sent me here expecting me to talk you into leaving or selling. I am not going to do that. What I came here and found instead is a clear survey discrepancy that puts your claim in the right, and I think you should know that I do not work for the kind of operation that overrides a lawful deed. Virginia looked at him for a long, careful moment. You work for the Beaumont Company, she said. I manage their cattle, he said. There is a difference, or there used to be. I am starting to see that the line may have gotten blurry while I was not paying attention. The back door opened then, and 2 children came in with the energy of people who have been outside and are very interested in the strange horse tied to the porch post. The girl was perhaps 12, with her mother's auburn hair and a directness that was clearly inherited. The boy was 9, with a gap between his front teeth and a suspicion of strangers that was also probably learned rather than innate. Nell Daniel, Virginia said, this is Mr. Covington. He has come about the land business. Nell looked at Nathan with an assessing gaze that was so similar to her mother's that he almost smiled. Daniel took a small step to stand slightly in front of his mother, which Nathan thought was one of the bravest things he had seen in a long while, because the boy was 9 years old and Nathan was considerably larger. Are you going to make us leave? Daniel asked. No, Nathan said, and he said it with a directness that matched the question. I am going to look into fixing the boundary problem. That night, Virginia fed him. There was no inn within 20 miles, and the frontier code of hospitality was older than the property dispute. They ate corn bread and beans with dried salt pork, and Nell and Daniel watched Nathan with the calculating attention of children who have learned to read adult situations for information about their own safety. Nathan was careful and quiet at the table, and he told them a little about the cattle work, the drives, the distances, the particular personalities of different cattle, and Daniel eventually asked so many questions about horses that Nell told him he was being rude, and Virginia told Nell that a question is not rude, and there was a small, ordinary warmth to it that Nathan had not felt in a kitchen in a longer time than he wanted to examine. He slept in the barn, which was not much warmer than the open prairie, but was shelter from the wind that had come up at dusk. He lay in the dark and listened to it, and thought about what he had found here and what he was going to do about it. He had come to resolve a matter. The matter was resolving itself in a direction he had not anticipated, and something in the geography of it felt, to his very honest self-assessment, a great deal less like a cattle dispute and considerably more like the beginning of something he did not have a name for yet. In the morning, Virginia brought him coffee without any particular ceremony, just set it on the fence post near the barn door and walked back to the kitchen. It was the best coffee he had tasted in 3 days, and he thought that was probably not purely because of the coffee. He spent the morning riding the boundary line with her. She knew her land with the precision of someone who had walked every foot of it, and she explained the survey markers to him and showed him where the Beaumont cattle had been grazing into her grass, and where the old fence had been put up overnight, and he listened to all of it and looked at all of it, and felt the weight of what had been happening to her accumulate in him into something that was more than professional concern. "You have been fighting this alone for over a year," he said when they had stopped at the southeastern corner of her claim. "Yes," Virginia said simply. "Where is your nearest neighbor?" "The Hargrove family 4 miles west. They have their own troubles." She paused. "Elia's my husband. He had a brother in Nebraska. He offered to help after Elias died, but it would have meant selling and moving north, and this is my children's land. It was filed in our names. I was not willing to give it up." Nathan looked out across the spring prairie. The grass was coming in green beneath the old amber of last year's growth. To the north he could see the line of Beaumont's cattle, probably 200 head, drifting slowly on the other side of the boundary. "I am going to ride back to the winter camp," Nathan said. "I am going to put the boundary situation to Beaumont with the correct survey numbers. He needs to move that herd east." Virginia turned her horse to look at him, and when he says no, she asked, "Then I will have to make a decision about whether I keep working for a man who thinks a registered deed is an inconvenience rather than a law," Nathan said. Virginia studied him. The wind was moving the brim of her hat and she held it down with one hand. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It was a genuine question, not a challenge, and it deserved a genuine answer. "Because it is right," he said. And then, because he was an honest man, he added, "and because somebody should have done it 14 months ago, and I am sorry that nobody did." He rode for the Beaumont camp that afternoon. He found Harlan Beaumont in his large canvas field tent, going over his herd ledgers with his foreman, a hard-faced man named Wick who had been involved in more than a few of the boundary situations Nathan was now reconsidering his comfort with. Beaumont was 58 years old, thick through the middle, with a white mustache and the confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades getting what he wanted through money, volume, and a certain casual disregard for the inconvenience of smaller people. Nathan laid the 2 surveys on Beaumont's camp table side by side and explained the discrepancy. He did it clearly and without editorial comment, and then he waited. Beaumont looked at the surveys for a long time. Then he looked at Nathan with an expression that Nathan had seen before and had, he realized with some discomfort, chosen not to examine too carefully in the past. "I am aware of the 1876 survey," Beaumont said. Nathan went very still. "You knew about the boundary change." "I know that a resurvey on a late homestead claim does not override prior established grazing use," Beaumont said. "I have lawyers who tell me that." "It does override it," Nathan said. "The Homestead Act is federal law. Her deed is registered and current." "My lawyers." "With respect," Nathan said, and the words came out more firmly than he intended, Your lawyers have been wrong before, or they have been telling you what you pay them to tell you. The Rhodes claim is lawful. Her eastern boundary is 42 yards east of where we have been putting our cattle. We need to move the herd." The tent was quiet for a moment. Wick had gone very still in the way of a man who is watching to see which way a thing will fall. "Nathan," Beaumont said, with the particular patience of a man who is accustomed to getting his way, "I am going to tell you something. I have been patient with the widow because patience costs less than a fight. But the Cimarron Flats section is the best grazing ground in this county, and I intend to have it, one way or another." "What does one way or another mean?" Nathan asked. "It means that sometimes people decide on their own that a piece of land is more trouble than it is worth," Beaumont said. Nathan picked up both surveys from the table. He folded them carefully. He put the company's survey in his inside pocket. He kept his expression very level. "I am going to ride back to the Rhodes property," he said. "I am going to tell her that the Beaumont Company will be moving the herd east of the correct boundary, and I am going to help her document her claim properly for the county record. And then I am going to resign my position with this company." Beaumont looked at him. "You are throwing away 7 years of work over a widow's dirt farm." "I am throwing away 7 years of not asking enough questions," Nathan said. "Good evening, Mr. Beaumont." He walked out of the tent before Beaumont could respond, because he was not entirely sure he could keep his voice level if the conversation continued, and he was not a man who wanted to say things in anger that could not be unsaid. Wick followed him out. Nathan was saddling Calhoun when the foreman came to stand nearby with his thumbs in his belt. "You know Beaumont is not just going to let this go," Wick said. His voice was neutral. He was not making a threat, Nathan decided. He was making an observation. "I know," Nathan said. "He has the county sheriff in his pocket," Wick said, "and 2 of the 3 town councilmen in Caldwell." "Then she will need someone who is not in his pocket," Nathan said. He rode back to the Rhodes homestead in the long purple light of the Kansas evening. He arrived after dark, and the light from the window was warm and square against the darkness, and he could see Virginia's silhouette moving in the kitchen. He unsaddled Calhoun and put him in the small corral with the disapproving cow, and then stood at the edge of the porch. Virginia opened the door before he had to knock, which meant she had heard him ride up and had been watchful, which was a wise habit for a woman alone on the prairie. "What did he say?" she asked. "He knew about the resurvey all along," Nathan said. "He intends to continue pressing the claim regardless." Virginia's face did not show surprise. It showed the particular expression of someone who has already expected the worst and is simply having it confirmed. "And you?" "I resigned," Nathan said. Now her expression changed. "You resigned your position?" "Yes, ma'am, because of my property line. Because of what I found out about the company I was working for," he said. "Your property line was the specific moment, but it was a longer process of reasoning than just that." Virginia stood in the doorway for a moment, and then she stepped back. "Come in," she said. "I have cornbread left and there is coffee." He went in. Nell and Daniel were asleep. The house was quiet and warm from the banked fire. Virginia cut him cornbread and poured coffee and sat across from him at the table, and in the firelight she looked tired in a way that was not physical but deeper, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy alone for too long. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Nathan said, "we make sure your filing is airtight. I want to see the original survey notes, the filing documentation, the chain of title, everything. If Beaumont tries to challenge this in court, I want you to have documentation so thorough that it cannot be argued with. You know the law. I know land records," he said. "I have been managing range claims and boundary disputes for 7 years. I know exactly how they try to break a claim, and I know how to prevent it." There was a silence. The fire settled. Outside, the wind had dropped and the prairie was very still. "Why?" Virginia asked, and this time the question had a different weight to it. Not just "why are you helping me," but something more fundamental. You could go anywhere. You are free. You have no stake in this land. Why would you stay? Nathan looked at his coffee. He was an honest man, and honest men do not always have comfortable answers. "I do not have a clean answer to that," he said finally. "I can tell you the practical reasons, the injustice of the situation, the clarity of the legal right, the fact that Beaumont has been operating with a casualness towards smaller landholders that I should have examined sooner." He paused. "I can also tell you that when I rode down off that ridge yesterday morning and saw you drive that stake into the ground, there was something about it that I have not been able to stop thinking about." Virginia looked at him for a long moment. The firelight moved across her face. "I am not a woman who needs rescuing," she said. "It was not a rejection. It was important information." "I can see that," he said. "I am not here to rescue you. I would like to help you if you will let me, because I think you have been fighting something that should not take one person fighting alone, and because I am currently without employment and apparently riding towards something rather than away from it for the first time in quite a while." A small silence grew between them, and it was not an uncomfortable one. "The barn is yours as long as you need it," Virginia said finally. He slept better than he had in months. The following week was practical and busy in the way that frontier life makes everything practical and busy. Nathan began by riding to Caldwell himself and speaking to the land office clerk, not as a representative of the Beaumont Company this time, but as a private individual, and presenting the survey discrepancy in writing with copies of both documents attached. He was thorough and specific and calm, and the clerk, whose name was Morris, looked at the documents with the careful attention of a man who has suddenly realized that a problem he has been vaguely uncomfortable with for 2 years has just become very specifically documented. "I will put a formal notation in the record," Morris told him. "I would appreciate a certified copy of that notation," Nathan said. He got it. He sent a letter with that certified copy attached to the Federal Land Office in Wichita. He was not certain it would move quickly, because nothing moved quickly in the federal bureaucracy of 1878, but it established a formal record that could not be quietly removed from the county filing system without someone noticing. Back at the homestead, Nathan turned his attention to the physical work that had accumulated in the months since Elias Rhodes died. The corral needed mending. The roof of the small barn had a section where the sod had dried and cracked, and the spring rains would come through it. There was fence line along the northern boundary that had been knocked over by winter winds and needed resetting. He was careful about how he did these things. He had noticed, that first evening in the kitchen, the exact degree to which Virginia was managing a life that required 2 adults to sustain it. And he had also noticed how carefully she did not ask for help, how she absorbed every difficulty as though asking for assistance were a kind of defeat rather than a simple human necessity. So he was matter-of-fact about the work. He did not make it a favor. He did it the way a person does work when the work needs doing, and there are hands available to do it. Nell watched him with a skeptical intelligence that he found genuinely impressive. On the 3rd day, she came out to where he was resetting fence posts along the north line and stood nearby with her hands on her hips. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. "I do not know yet," he told her honestly, because he thought she deserved an honest answer. "My mother has not had anyone help her since Papa died," Nell said. "Before that, they helped each other." "That is how it should be," Nathan said, knocking the post deeper with the mallet. "She is sad," Nell said, "but she does not show it because she thinks Daniel and I need her to be strong." Nathan looked at the girl, 12 years old, with that auburn hair and those clear eyes. "Your mother is one of the strongest people I have met," he said, "and I think being sad and being strong at the same time is not a contradiction. It is actually a pretty remarkable thing." Nell considered this. "She likes the stars," she said, as though this were relevant information he should have. "At night sometimes, when she thinks we are asleep, she goes out on the porch and sits there and looks at them." Nathan had noticed that. On the 2nd night he had been up late, unable to sleep, and had seen from the crack of the barn door the dark shape of Virginia on the porch steps, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face turned up. He had stayed in the barn because that moment was not his, and because there are some things a person needs to do alone. Daniel's conversion from suspicion to enthusiasm took somewhat longer, but was more complete when it arrived. It came on a Thursday when Nathan was working with Calhoun in the small corral, and Daniel came out and stood on the fence rail watching with those serious dark eyes, and eventually said, very quietly, "Could I pet him?" "You can do more than that," Nathan said. "Come here." By the end of an hour, Daniel had groomed Calhoun and led him around the corral twice, and was talking more than Nathan had heard him talk in a week, about horses and cattle, and whether Nathan had ever seen a buffalo, and Nathan told him about the great herds he had seen farther south when he was younger, before the hunters had reduced them. And he watched the boy's face as he described it, and felt a complicated grief for what that world had been before the frontier economy had reshaped it so thoroughly and so irreversibly. Virginia came out of the house to see what the noise was and found her son leading a large roan horse around the corral with the solemnity of someone completing an important task. She stood at the fence and Nathan came to stand a few feet away. "He is a natural," Nathan said. Virginia watched Daniel with an expression that was love and sorrow and pride all mixed together. "His father wanted to teach him," she said quietly. "He was going to start him on horseback in the spring. And then the fever came in January." Nathan said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. He stood next to her at the fence while Daniel led Calhoun with great concentration, and the afternoon sun was warm on the prairie and the smell of the turned kitchen garden came on the breeze, and it was the kind of ordinary moment that is never ordinary when you are inside it. "May I ask you something?" Virginia said after a while. "Yes." "Why are you still here? The documentation is filed. You have done what needed doing legally. You do not have to stay." Nathan watched Calhoun's patient progress around the corral. "No," he agreed. "I do not have to stay." There was a pause. "The roof of the barn still needs proper repair," he said. "And your fence line on the south boundary is worse than the north." "Those are reasons for a few more days," Virginia said. "Not a reason to stay." He turned to look at her then, and she was already looking at him, and between them there was that particular quality of attention that passes between two people who are both aware that a conversation has moved from one territory into another. "I am aware," Nathan said, "that riding up to somebody's homestead with the intention of representing the company that has been making her life difficult is not what most people would call a promising start." Something shifted in Virginia's expression, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "No," she said, "it is not. I am also aware," he continued, "that I have been here for 10 days and that I have not wanted to leave, and that the reason I have not wanted to leave has less and less to do with fence posts." Virginia turned back to watch her son. The not-quite smile stayed. "The fence posts still need doing," she said. "I know," he said. "I will finish them." He did finish them, and the barn roof, and the section of the kitchen garden fence that had collapsed under the weight of last autumn's dead vines. And when he was done with all of those things, it was the end of April and the spring was fully arrived, and he was still there. There was a difficulty that arose in the third week of May. Wick arrived with 4 Beaumont riders, not threatening in any direct way, but moving a section of the cattle herd to graze along the boundary line in a way that was clearly meant to establish presence and pressure. Virginia watched them from the porch with her arms folded, and Nathan watched from beside her. "He is trying to intimidate without doing anything that can be formally complained about," Nathan said. "I know what he is doing," Virginia said. "He did the same thing 3 times last summer. This time you have documentation and a federal filing," Nathan said. "And this time he knows someone who knows exactly how his operation works is here, which limits what he can do." He rode out to the boundary line where Wick and his men had positioned themselves, and he spoke with Wick directly, quietly, without theater. He cited the survey numbers and the county notation and the federal filing, and he told Wick that any cattle crossing the marked line would be documented and reported to both the county and the federal land office. Wick listened with the expression of a man who is calculating costs and benefits. "You know this is going to make things hard for you," Wick said. "Things are already hard," Nathan said. "That is not news." Wick pulled his cattle back to the correct boundary that afternoon and rode away without further incident, and Nathan came back to the homestead and told Virginia what had happened, and she nodded with a look on her face that was not relief so much as the particular alert quiet of someone who knows a battle has been won but the war has not. "He will try something else," she said. "Yes," Nathan agreed, "but we are more prepared for it than you were." "We." Neither of them remarked on the word, but it was there between them, solid and deliberate. On a clear May evening, when the children were asleep and the prairie was quiet, and the stars were making their enormous argument against the darkness, Virginia was on the porch when Nathan came out of the barn to check that Calhoun was properly settled, and she did not go inside when she heard him, and so he came and stood at the edge of the porch, and they stood in the dark together for a while in a comfortable silence that had been building for weeks. "Elias used to say that the stars were the same stars as in Virginia, where I was born," she said, looking up. "He liked that about them, that the distance you traveled did not change them." "That is a good way to think about them," Nathan said. "I came from a small town in Virginia when I was 18, she said. "My family did not think much of my going west with a man they considered a dreamer. They said Elias was too full of plans and too short on practical sense." "And was he?" Virginia was quiet for a moment. "He was full of plans, certainly. Some of them were not practical. But he was good and he was honest and he loved us with everything he had, and when I think about him, that is what I think about first. Not the plans that did not work, just the fact of him being good." She paused. "I miss him every day." Nathan listened to this with the attention it deserved. "He sounds like someone worth missing," he said. "He was." Virginia turned to look at Nathan in the darkness. He could see the pale of her face and the dark of her eyes. "Are you from somewhere?" she asked. "I have been talking about myself, but I do not know much about you." "Tennessee originally," he said. "Left when I was 22. I have been moving since." "What are you moving toward?" she asked. It was a gentle question but a direct one. He thought about it. "I used to think I was just moving," he said. "Working, putting miles behind me. I am beginning to think I may have been moving towards something I could not describe until now." The night was enormous around them. The spring insects had begun to make their noise in the grass, and from somewhere to the south a coyote called once and was answered. "Nathan," Virginia said, and his name in her voice was something he had not been prepared for. "I need to tell you something." "All right." "I am not a woman who takes things lightly," she said. "I am not looking for something temporary. I have 2 children and a homestead and a dispute with a cattle company that is not finished, and my life is not simple, and I am not finished grieving Elias. Not fully. I do not think I will ever be completely finished." "I know that," he said. "And I am telling you," she continued carefully, "because I think you understand that something is happening between us, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. But I need you to understand what you are considering, which is a complicated life with a complicated woman who comes with considerable difficulty attached." Nathan looked at her in the dark. He had been many places and met many people, and he had never heard a person describe themselves with quite this combination of honesty and quiet self-possession, and it moved him more than any softness or artifice could have. "Virginia," he said, and her name felt important in a way he could not explain, "I have been sleeping in your barn for 3 weeks. I rode back from the Beaumont camp and resigned my employment for something I had not yet found a name for. I am not a man who does things accidentally. I think I know exactly what I am considering." The silence between them was charged and warm, and the stars were very present. "I think," Virginia said finally, with a care that held no coyness whatsoever, "that if you were to sit on this porch step, that would be all right." He came up onto the porch and sat on the step, and she sat beside him, and the gap between them was only a few inches, and neither of them closed it that night, because neither of them needed to. Being close was enough. The acknowledgement was enough. They sat and looked at the stars for a long time and talked about small things and large things, about the children, about the farm, about the land itself and what it might be made into with time and work. About Tennessee, and about Virginia the state, and about how the prairie changed a person in ways that were irreversible. About the sound the wind made at different times of year. About the difference between loneliness and solitude. It was the longest conversation Nathan had had with anyone in years. When she finally went inside and he went back to the barn, he lay on his bedroll in the dark and pressed one hand against his chest, where something had settled that felt like coming home, which was a feeling he had not been sure he was going to know again in his life. June arrived with its full prairie summer, the heat building in the afternoons and the sky going enormous and blue, and with it came the first real test of what Nathan had set in motion. A letter arrived from Harland Beaumont, delivered by a county rider, addressed to Virginia Rhodes and copied to what appeared to be the county commissioner's office. The letter stated that the Beaumont Cattle Company intended to file a formal challenge to the 1876 survey on the grounds that the original 1874 survey established prior rights, and that this challenge was being made to the county court in Caldwell. Virginia read it twice and put it on the table and looked at it with her hands flat on the surface as though she were keeping it from rising off the wood. "He has friends in the county court," she said. "I know," Nathan said. "But the federal filing changes the landscape. He cannot challenge a federal land registration in county court." "Can he?" "He can try," Nathan said, "but the federal registration supersedes the county. I need to write to the land office in Wichita and let them know what is happening, and I need to contact a federal land agent." He had, over the preceding weeks, been composing letters to several people. A federal land agent he had met during a previous cattle drive, a former colleague who had left the cattle business and was now managing range disputes for a legal firm in Abilene, and a former territorial surveyor who had done original survey work in this county and whose notes might be relevant. These were not the actions of a man passing through. Virginia looked at him across the table with the morning light coming through the single glass window and casting its particular flattering gold across the kitchen. "Nathan," she said. "Yes. I am glad you stayed." He looked at her. She was looking at him with a straightforwardness that was characteristic of everything she did, and it was the most direct thing she had said to him in the 6 weeks since he had appeared on her ridge, and it landed somewhere in the center of him. "So am I," he said. He spent that day writing letters, and the next day rode to Caldwell to deliver them. He also went to see the county clerk and lodged a formal response to Beaumont's challenge, citing the federal registration and the corrected survey. He was courteous and thorough, and left the clerk with paper that he suspected Morris would file without delay, because Morris was a careful man who had recognized that the political weather in Caldwell was shifting. 2 weeks later, a federal land agent named Cresswell rode out from Wichita and reviewed the documentation personally. Nathan was there when he arrived, and he introduced him to Virginia, and he watched Cresswell review the documentation with the methodical attention of a man who has seen this kind of dispute many times and knows exactly what it looks like when one party is right and the other party is pressing purely on economic weight. Cresswell looked at the surveys, the filing, the boundary markers, the county challenge documents, and then he rode the eastern boundary line with Nathan and Virginia both, and he stood at the stake in the ground, the original stake, which was still there, the calico faded now but still flying, and he made notes in his ledger. "The federal filing is current and correct," Cresswell said at the end of the day. He said it plainly, the way a man says a factual thing. "The county challenge is not going to succeed. The Beaumont Company's 1874 survey predates the Homestead filing, but does not supersede it under the 1862 Act. I will put my findings in a formal letter to the county and to the company." Virginia said thank you in a voice that was entirely level, which Nathan knew by now meant that she was feeling something much larger than that. After Cresswell rode away, she went to the stake and stood looking at it for a long moment. Nathan stood a few feet behind her, giving her the space to have whatever moment this was. Then she turned around, and her eyes were bright, and she crossed the ground between them and put her arms around him in a way that was not tentative or calculated but simply real and human and full of relief. And he folded his arms around her and held her with a care that was also entirely real. She pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment. He felt her breathe out a long, ragged exhale that had 14 months of carrying everything alone in it. "It is going to be all right," he said very quietly. "I know," she said. And then, a moment later, "I need you to know that I am not crying." "I can see that," he said, and he could hear something in his own voice that was close to the same condition. They stood like that for a moment in the summer grass, with the faded calico flag behind them and the wide Kansas sky above. And when she stepped back, she looked at him with wet eyes and a directness that was entirely undisguised. And he knew with a clarity that had nothing to do with land records or boundary surveys that whatever this was between them had moved into territory that was no longer preliminary. "I think," Virginia said, "that we should probably talk." "I think so too," Nathan said. They walked back slowly toward the homestead, and the conversation they had over the next hour was not the kind that happens on porches in the dark looking at stars, but the kind that happens in the practical light of day with full knowledge of all the complications. Virginia talked about Elias with an honesty that he listened to completely. She loved him. She missed him. That was a thing that was simply true and was not going to change. And she needed Nathan to understand that loving again did not mean replacing or diminishing. Nathan told her things he had not told anyone in a long time about the years of moving, the deliberate avoidance of attachment, the way that solitude can become a habit that feels like preference but is actually just fear wearing a practical coat. He told her that he had been afraid, for a long time, of wanting something too much and losing it. "My life has not been particularly gentle," Virginia said. "I noticed that," Nathan said. "You do not seem to have been broken by it." "I have been bent by it," she said, "considerably, but bending is not breaking, and I have learned to be careful about which direction I bend." He took her hand on the porch in the afternoon light. It was the first deliberate touch between them, unhurried and chosen, and her hand in his was warm and calloused and entirely herself. "I am not proposing anything on a porch in the middle of a summer afternoon," he said, "because that would be very fast and probably seem unserious, but I want you to know where I am standing." "I know where you are standing," Virginia said. "I am glad you are standing there." Summer deepened, and the homestead began to show what it could be with two adults working it properly. Nathan's knowledge of land management and animal husbandry complemented Virginia's intimate knowledge of the specific character of the property and its particular challenges. They expanded the kitchen garden, added a second storage structure, repaired the full fence line, and began serious preparations for putting in a larger crop the following spring. There was a rhythm to the days that was functional and increasingly joyful. In the mornings, Nathan and Daniel often rode the boundary or worked the small herd of cattle that Nathan had acquired through a modest purchase from a passing drive 6 head, with the intention of building from there. In the afternoons, Virginia worked the garden and the household management with Nell alongside her, and sometimes Nathan worked with them on the heavier tasks. In the evenings, all four of them were together at the table for the meal, and after the children went to bed, Nathan and Virginia sat on the porch or at the table and talked. The conversations ranged from the deeply practical water rights, soil composition, whether to try winter wheat, to the kind of thing that people say to each other when the walls between them have come down entirely. Nathan told her about a particular night in his first year with the cattle company, when he had been riding night watch alone on a drive in Colorado territory, and had looked up at the mountains and felt a loneliness so specific and complete that he had promised himself he would not examine it too closely, because he did not know what to do with what he would find. Virginia told him about the morning after Elias died, the first morning she had woken up alone in the bed, and the strange mechanical quality of getting up and making breakfast for the children, and how the performance of ordinary things had been the only anchor she could find. These were the things that make two people actually known to each other, and they were known to each other in that way by the end of August. Nathan was fully installed in the house by then. He had, with Virginia's full agreement and the children's enthusiastic support, moved from the barn into the small room that had originally been intended as a storage room, and that they had converted together over several weekends. He was not in her room, and there was a proprietiness to the arrangement that was entirely appropriate and unforced, but he was in the house, and it was that home's home in a way it had not been since Elias died. In September, there was a town social in Caldwell, and Virginia and Nathan attended together. This was the first time they appeared publicly as a pair, and Virginia was aware of the attention, some of it kind and some of it the particular kind of narrow-eyed assessment that small frontier communities specialize in. She walked into that social hall with Nathan beside her, and she held herself the way she always held herself, upright and clear-eyed, and she let the talk be what it was going to be, because it could not be prevented, and worrying about it had never in her experience changed anything. Mrs. Hargrove from 4 miles west came to her immediately with the warmth of a genuine friend, and shook Nathan's hand with great approval. The Reverend Calloway spoke to them at length about the land dispute situation with the frank political opinion that Beaumont's methods had been questionable, which was brave of him to say, and which Nathan later told Virginia represented a measurable shift in community sentiment. At some point in the evening, Beaumont himself appeared, which Virginia had not expected. He came in with 2 of his town associates, and the room noticed his arrival in the way a room notices when a significant weight shifts. He did not approach Virginia. He spoke with the commissioner and the banker, and he glanced once toward where Nathan and Virginia were standing, and the look he gave Nathan was the flat, assessing look of a man who is recalculating his options. Nathan met that look steadily. He said nothing and did nothing, and after a moment Beaumont looked away. Later that evening, Virginia and Nathan danced. The fiddle player was excellent and the music was lively, and Virginia had not danced since before Elias got sick, and she found that her body remembered how before her mind did. Nathan was not an elaborate dancer, but he was solid and reliable with the rhythm, and he held her with the proper formality of a frontier dance while looking at her with an expression that had nothing formal about it. And she laughed at something he said, and the laughter felt entirely clean, like something that had been washed and dried properly for the first time in a long while. They drove home in the wagon under the stars, with Nell and Daniel asleep in the wagon bed beneath a quilt, and the night was cool and the road was quiet, and Virginia sat beside Nathan on the seat with their shoulders touching, and it was a warm, complete, uncomplicated happiness. "I have been thinking," Nathan said into the quiet. About permanence," he said. "About the difference between helping with a problem and building a life." Virginia looked at the road ahead, at the way the moonlight made the prairie silver. "Yes," she said. "I would like to build a life," he said. "With you and with Nell and Daniel on your land. I want to be clear that I understand it is your land and your children and your life that I would be asking to be part of, not the other way around. I am not asking you to fit yourself into something I have made. I am asking if I can fit myself into something you have built." Virginia turned to look at him in the moonlight. He was looking at the road, giving her space to respond without the pressure of his direct gaze, which was a thing she had noticed about him over the months. He understood when to look and when to give space, and the distinction was always correct. "Nathan Covington," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Are you asking me to marry you from a wagon seat in the middle of the road at 11 o'clock at night?" There was a pause. "I believe I am," he said. "It is not ideal in terms of setting." "No," she agreed. Another pause. "Virginia Rhodes," he said, "would you do me the significant honor of marrying me?" She looked at his profile in the moonlight, the strong jaw, the line of his nose, the gray eyes that were now turned toward her with an expression that was all the way open, with no calculation or reserve in it, just a man asking a real question with a real heart. "Yes," she said simply. He let out a breath that had clearly been held. Then he reached over with one hand, keeping the other on the reins, and took her hand, and held it, and they rode the rest of the way home in a quiet that was more full of content than any words could have been. They were married in October, on a bright fall morning when the prairie was turning gold, and the air had that particular sharpness that comes before the first frost. Reverend Calloway officiated in the small church in Caldwell, and the Hargrove family attended, and several other homestead families from the surrounding area who had watched the boundary dispute and the outcome with considerable interest and who were, it seemed, genuinely pleased at how things had turned out. Nell stood beside her mother with a bouquet of prairie wildflowers, dried from the summer since fresh flowers were not available in October, and her expression was one of pure, slightly overwhelming happiness. Daniel stood beside Nathan with the gravity of someone taking a significant role seriously, and when Reverend Calloway asked if anyone had objections, Daniel checked the room with such thoroughness that several people smiled. There were no objections. Nathan said his vows looking directly at Virginia, and Virginia said hers looking directly at Nathan, and there was nothing performed or theatrical about either of them. They simply meant what they said, plainly and completely, the way people who have already done the internal work of deciding mean things. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold and challenging and deeply ordinary in the best possible sense. Virginia and Nathan worked the homestead through the season together, managing the cattle, keeping the sheep through the worst of a February snowstorm that lasted 3 days, doing the endless indoor maintenance work of a frontier home, mending harness, repairing tools, patching clothes, preserving and managing food stores. They were in those months discovering each other in the daily and the ordinary, which is the only real way to discover a person. Nathan was methodical and patient. Virginia was quick and creative. They argued twice, once about the best way to mend a specific section of the south fence, and once about whether to sell 2 of the cattle before spring, real disagreements about real things, and both arguments were resolved by a combination of listening and compromise that left neither of them feeling defeated. The fence was mended Nathan's way because the logic was sound. The cattle were sold on Virginia's schedule because she knew the market better. They were equal, which was a thing Nathan had not fully understood until he was inside it. He had thought of it in theory, the idea of a partnership of genuine equals, but he had not understood what it felt like in practice, the way that sharing work and decisions with someone who is fully capable makes both people larger rather than smaller. He fell more deeply in love with her every month, which was not something he had expected. He had assumed that what he felt in October would be the fullness of it, and he discovered instead that October had been the beginning. In November, Beaumont made one final attempt to challenge the eastern boundary, this time through a filing in the county court arguing the prior grazing rights question. Nathan had prepared for exactly this scenario. He had the federal land agent Cresswell's formal letter, the original survey notes from the former territorial surveyor he had contacted, and a brief prepared by the Abilene legal firm that laid out the federal precedence argument in terms that were extremely clear. The county judge, not a Beaumont ally as it turned out, since Beaumont owned the commissioner rather than the judge, reviewed the documentation over 3 days and dismissed the challenge with a written order that stated plainly that the 1876 federal registration was controlling, and that no county challenge of a federal homestead registration was within the court's jurisdiction. Virginia read the order twice and then put it in the tin box with her original deed. "It is done," she said. Nathan looked at her across the table. "It is done," he agreed. Virginia sat down and looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "I planted that stake because I had nothing left to lose," she said. "I need you to know that. I was not brave. I was just at the end of what I had, and sometimes that looks like courage from the outside." "I do not think those two things are as different as you think they are," Nathan said. "Maybe not," she said, "but I want to tell you something." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "The day you rode down that ridge, I thought you were another problem, and then I thought you were an unexpected ally, and then I thought you might be something more than that. And now you are the answer to a question I had stopped asking myself because I thought asking it was a kind of foolishness I could not afford." Nathan turned his hand to hold hers. "What question?" he asked. "Whether I was going to be happy again," she said. "Not content, not managing, happy." He looked at her face, at the woman who had driven a stake into disputed earth with the wind in her hair and 2 children to protect, and 14 months of grief behind her and more difficulty ahead of her than most people ever face, and he felt something in his chest that was too large for any word he could think of. "Are you," he asked, "happy?" Virginia smiled, and it was a full smile, not the careful partial expression she had used in those first weeks when she was still determining whether he was trustworthy, but a complete, unguarded smile that changed her whole face. "Considerably," she said. "Spring came again to Cimarron Flats, and it came differently. The second spring was not a season of siege, but a season of building. Nathan and Virginia put in the largest crop the homestead had ever attempted, 40 acres of winter wheat that had been planted in the fall, and was coming up green and strong, supplemented by an expanded kitchen garden and a field of corn along the western edge of the property. They had 16 head of cattle now, managed on a rotation that kept the grass healthy, and the sheep were producing wool that Virginia had arranged to sell through a textile buyer in Caldwell. Daniel, who had turned 10 in January, was by now a confident rider and was doing real work with the cattle, and he was so clearly his father's child in his earnestness and his curiosity that Virginia sometimes looked at him and felt the particular bittersweet of love that holds 2 things at once. Nell, at 13, was developing into a young woman of formidable intelligence who had decided she wanted to be a teacher, and Virginia had begun ordering books from Wichita to support what was clearly a serious ambition. In April, Virginia and Nathan sat on the porch in the spring evening, and Virginia told him something she had been keeping for a week while she was certain. "We are going to have a child," she said. Nathan was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that was not the cautious happiness of a man who is calculating implications, but the full, uncalculated happiness of a man who is simply in the fact of it. "When?" he asked. "October, I think," Virginia said. "Late October." He put his arm around her on the porch step, and she leaned against him, and they sat in the warm spring dark while the prairie made its enormous quiet noises around them. "I am glad," he said simply. "So am I," she said. "I was not certain I would be. I had to think about it for a moment when I first knew. Because Elias never got to know Daniel as more than a child, and I thought about what it means to bring a new person into a family that has already had loss in it." She paused. "And then I thought about what this land is going to be and what it already is, and I thought that this child is going to come into something good and solid, and that is not nothing. That is a great deal." "That is everything," Nathan said. He was right. The summer was long and warm and full of work and laughter, and the growing fact of new life. Virginia worked through the summer with a practicality about her pregnancy that was entirely characteristic. She modified what she did as necessary, and did not modify what was not necessary, and she resisted suggestions that she should rest more with the polite but firm persistence of a woman who had been managing her own health on a frontier homestead for 6 years, and was quite confident in her assessment of what she could and could not do. Nathan, for his part, took on more of the outdoor physical work without making a production of it, and he did it with the quiet competence that was his particular quality, and Virginia noticed and said nothing about it except once when she said, "You are doing the heavy fence posts again," and he said, The fence posts needed doing, and she said, "I know." And there was a warmth in that exchange that was entirely domestic and entirely lovely. Nell and Daniel were told about the coming child in May. Nell's response was immediate and enthusiastic and organizational. She began compiling a list of things that would be needed. Daniel's response was a long, thoughtful silence followed by the question of whether, if it was a boy, he could teach him to ride, and Nathan told him that would be his specific responsibility, and Daniel looked satisfied with this. The wheat came in beautifully in August, more than Nathan had projected, and the sale of the harvest through the Caldwell grain buyer was the best financial result the Rhodes homestead had ever had. Virginia sat with the ledger in the evening and looked at the numbers with an expression that Nathan loved, which was the expression of someone who has worked very hard for something and is now looking at evidence that the work was worth it. "We could put a proper wood floor in the house," she said. "We could," Nathan agreed, "and extend the barn another 12 feet. We will need it with the herd size we are planning." "Both are good ideas," Nathan said. Virginia closed the ledger and looked at him. "Elias and I always talked about the wood floor," she said. "He had it on his list of things to do once the farm was established. I want you to know that I am thinking about him when I say that, not in a sad way, in a grateful way." "That we are finally here," Nathan nodded. "I understand," he said, "and I think Elias Rhodes would be pleased that his land and his children are well." Virginia looked at him steadily. "I think he would have liked you," she said. "That matters to me." "It matters to me too," Nathan said, and he meant it. The floor went in September. A proper wood plank floor that Nell and Daniel both walked across with exaggerated ceremony on the first morning. And Virginia sat in her rocking chair in the kitchen and put her hands flat on the arms and looked around at the kitchen with the new floor and the clean scrubbed walls and the calendar open to September of 1879. And she felt the fullness of her life in a way that was larger than she could entirely contain. Nathan came in from the morning chores and saw her sitting there and stopped in the doorway. "All right?" he asked. "More than all right," she said. He hung his hat and sat across from her at the table. "Tell me," he said, because this was something they did, not letting things that mattered go unspoken. "I am thinking about a year ago," she said. "About all of it. The boundary challenge and the stake and you riding down that ridge, and then all the months in between, and now we have a wood floor and a baby coming and the wheat sold, and I am thinking that I was very close at several points to not being here anymore. To having given in and moved north or sold the claim or any number of things that felt like the only possible choice in the moment. And I did not, and I am glad I did not." "I am considerably glad you did not," Nathan said. "And I am glad you were not the kind of man who came down that ridge and did what Beaumont sent you to do," she said, "because the story could have gone very differently." "It could have," he agreed. "I think it went the right way." "I think so too," Virginia said. In the last week of October, on a clear, cold morning when the first frost had already been and gone, and the prairie was the color of old gold in the morning light, Virginia gave birth to their son. The labor was attended by Mrs. Hargrove, who was the most capable woman in the county for these purposes, and by the Caldwell doctor who had ridden out the evening before at Nathan's request when Virginia's labor began. It was a hard labor, as labors often were, and Nathan spent several hours on the porch with Daniel and Nell doing the inadequate but necessary thing of being calm for the children, while inside the house everything important was happening. When Mrs. Hargrove opened the door and told him he could come in, Nathan walked through the kitchen and into the bedroom, and Virginia was sitting up in the bed looking tired and completely alive and entirely herself. And there was a small, indignant, very real person wrapped in the quilt her mother had made. And Virginia looked up at him, and her face was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "He is very loud," Nell said from the corner, with enormous satisfaction. "He is healthy," the doctor said with professional pleasure. "Good strong boy." Nathan sat on the edge of the bed and Virginia put the baby in his arms, and he looked down at this new small face that was going to be someone, and felt the weight of it, not a burden but the other kind of weight, the substantial kind that means that something is real. "What shall we call him?" Virginia asked. They had discussed names without settling on any. Nathan looked at the boy and then up at Virginia. "You should choose," he said. "You did the work." Virginia laughed, which he had not expected, and the laugh was tired and genuine and full of life. "James," she said. "James Elias Covington." Nathan looked at her. She was looking at him with clear eyes and a steadiness that was Virginia at her absolute center. "James Elias Covington," he repeated, and the name held everything, the present and the past, and the full acknowledgement of the life that had come before this one, woven in rather than erased. "That is a good name," Daniel said seriously from the doorway. "It is a perfect name," Nell confirmed. Nathan held his son in the October light coming through the clean glass window, and outside the prairie was gold and enormous and entirely itself. And in the warmth of that small room full of people he loved, he felt something he had been moving toward for 36 years arrive fully and completely. Home. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the best winter Nathan had ever spent, which was a remarkable thing to say about a Kansas winter that featured 3 serious blizzards and a February ice storm that kept them housebound for 4 days. James was a loud, opinionated, healthy baby who had his mother's eyes, and what Nell declared was definitely Nathan's nose, a claim Nathan disputed on insufficient grounds. Daniel was devoted to his little brother with a protectiveness that was entirely characteristic of him. Nell had started teaching Nell a book-based curriculum of her own devising, which was ambitious enough that Virginia had supplemented it with a second order of books from Wichita. During the 4 days of the ice storm, when they were all confined to the house, they played cards and Nathan taught Daniel chess on a set he had carved from cedar wood over the fall, and Virginia read aloud from a novel in the evenings, while James slept in his cradle, and the ice tapped against the windows, and the fire made its small, determined warmth. On the 3rd night of the ice storm, when both children and the baby were asleep and the house was quiet, Virginia and Nathan sat together at the table in the low light of the single lamp. "I have been thinking about the spring," Nathan said. "What about it?" "I want to add another 20 acres to the wheat," he said. "And I think if we sell 4 of the cattle in March, we can use that money to put in a proper well closer to the house rather than carrying from the creek." Virginia nodded. She had been thinking about the well too. "Yes to both," she said. "And I want to try sunflowers in the east field this year along the boundary. They are good for the soil and the seeds can be sold." "Sunflowers in the east field," Nathan repeated, smiling slightly. "Along the boundary," Virginia said, and there was a warmth in the way she said it that held everything the boundary had meant, the stake and the calico flag and the struggle and the arrival of an unexpected ally on a spring morning and everything that had followed. Nathan looked at her. "Along the boundary," he agreed. Virginia reached across the table and covered his hand with both of hers. "Nathan," she said. "Yes." "Thank you," she said, "for staying, for all of it. For the fence posts and the legal documents and the Cresswell letter, and teaching Daniel to ride and arguing with me about the south fence, and all of the 10,000 small things that add up to a life." Her voice was steady but full. "Thank you for being the kind of man who came down that ridge and changed his mind." Nathan turned his hand to hold hers, and he looked at her in the lamplight with everything he felt fully present in his face, held back by nothing. "Virginia Rhodes," he said, using her name with the particular deliberateness he sometimes employed when he wanted her to understand he meant the specific entirety of her. "You planted a flag on your land the morning I found you, and it was the most honest, fierce, unambiguous thing I had ever seen anyone do, and I have been following that flag ever since." Virginia looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled, the full, unguarded smile that he had loved from the first time he saw it, which was one ordinary afternoon in June when Nell had said something sharp and unexpected that surprised it out of her. "You are a very good man," she said. "I am trying to be," he said. "You make it considerably easier." Outside, the ice was still falling, but inside the small house on Cimarron Flats, with the wheat stored and the cattle healthy and the baby sleeping and the children warm and the wood floor gleaming, and the first months of a proper life wrapped around all of them like a quilt made of all the right pieces, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The spring came with the thoroughness it always did on the Kansas prairie, the cold breaking in March and the ground softening, and the winter wheat showing its color before the snow had fully released it. The sunflowers went in along the eastern boundary in April, planted by Virginia and Nathan together, row by row along the line where the red calico flag had snapped in the wind 3 years before. The stake was still there. Virginia had never removed it. It had become part of the fence line, incorporated into the post at the corner, and she liked it there. Harlan Beaumont sold his Cimarron operations to a smaller outfit in the summer of 1880 and moved his primary business south toward the Texas Panhandle, following the cattle drives as they shifted. The new company that bought the grazing rights on the eastern sections had no interest in pursuing old disputes and sent a rider to introduce themselves as neighbors, which Virginia received courteously, and which Nathan received with a quiet relief he expressed only to Virginia. "It is finished," he said on the porch that evening. "It has been finished for a while," she said. "This is just the official version." "Yes," he agreed, smiling. James was pulling himself upright using Nathan's knee as a support, conducting his ongoing campaign to achieve vertical locomotion with the same stubborn intensity that Virginia brought to everything she cared about. Nathan watched him with a fondness that was slightly overwhelming in its simplicity. "He is going to walk soon," Daniel said from the porch step, where he was whittling under Nathan's instruction. "He is going to run soon," Nell corrected, from the chair where she was reading by the remaining evening light. "Look at how determined he is." Virginia watched her son, who was indeed extremely determined, and leaned against Nathan's shoulder. Nathan put his arm around her in the unhurried way of two people for whom this is simply what they do, as natural as breathing, as simple and as necessary. James took 2 uncertain, triumphant steps, fell magnificently, sat up with an expression of absolute outrage, and then grinned. "There it is," Nathan said. All of them were laughing, and the sound of it went out into the spring evening and across the land that was registered and certain and theirs, bordered on the east by a line of young sunflowers that were just beginning to show their first green leaves, bright against the enormous, open, endlessly patient Kansas sky. In the years that followed, the homestead grew the way things grow when they are properly tended and loved. A proper barn by 1882, fully twice the size of the original. A second structure for the growing sheep herd. A school that Nell helped establish in Caldwell in 1884 when she was 18, supported by a group of homestead families who believed in it with a fierceness that the frontier breeds in people who understand what education means to their children's futures. Daniel at 15 was the horseman he had always promised to be, and Nathan had the particular satisfaction of watching him come into his own skill and competence. Not as Nathan's achievement, but as Daniel's, because Nathan had always understood that his role was to provide the ground and let the growing happen. James learned to walk and then to run, and then to talk in full sentences at an age that surprised everyone, and he combined his mother's directness with his father's patience in a way that made him, at 3 years old, unexpectedly good at negotiating the dynamics of a household with 2 older siblings who had opinions. And Virginia Rhodes, who had driven a stake into the earth on a spring morning in 1878 with nothing but her own determination and the clear record of her legal right, and the refusal to be moved from what was hers. Virginia was, by 1884, a figure in the county. Not in any formal way, not in any way that involved titles or offices, but in the way that a person becomes the ground other people orient by. Homestead families in dispute sought her counsel because she had been through it and come out the other side with the documentation to prove exactly how it worked. The land office in Caldwell sent new homestead filers to speak with her when they had questions about boundary registrations, because she understood the system as well as the clerk did. She had become, without intending to, a practical authority on what it meant to hold your ground when the ground was all you had. Nathan managed their operation with a skill that put them in the upper tier of Cimarron Flats farm families, not rich, but genuinely comfortable with a growing herd, a wheat operation that was reliable enough to plan around, and the sunflower field along the eastern boundary that had become, somewhat unexpectedly, one of their most reliable income sources. The seeds sold consistently, and in August, when the sunflowers were in full flower, the eastern boundary of the Rhodes Covington homestead was visible from half a mile away, a line of gold against the green and amber of the prairie, marking the land as clearly and beautifully as the red calico flag had done years before. On a Sunday morning in August of 1884, Virginia and Nathan were standing at the eastern fence line, the proper, well-built fence that had replaced the original rough post line years ago, looking at the sunflowers in full bloom. James was 6 years old and racing along the fence line the way 6-year-olds race, which is to say with maximum noise and minimum regard for direction. Nell had ridden into Caldwell the evening before for a teachers' meeting and was staying with the Hargroves. Daniel was at the barn, doing the morning work that he had claimed as his own territory. The sunflowers were extraordinary in the morning light. They faced east into the rising sun, which seemed entirely appropriate. "I want to show you something," Virginia said. She walked to the old fence corner where the stake still stood, incorporated into the post. The red calico had long since weathered away. The weather takes everything eventually, but the stake was still there, solid and true in the earth. "I come here sometimes," she said, "when I want to think." "I know," Nathan said. He had seen her walking here over the years, in the early mornings sometimes, or in the evenings. Virginia put her hand on the post. "I planted this when I thought there was nothing left," she said. "I did not know when I drove it in that it was the beginning of something. I thought it was the end of my rope and I was tying a knot in it to hold on." "Turned out it was a signal fire," Nathan said. Virginia turned to look at him with a smile that held all of it, the struggle and the loss and the unexpected grace of what followed. "Turned out it was," she said. Nathan stood beside her at the old post in the August morning, with the sunflowers blazing and James racing somewhere nearby making the sounds of adventure, and he felt the full weight and quality of his life around him, the way a good piece of land feels solid under your feet, yielding to cultivation, and entirely real. He took her hand. "I am glad I rode down that ridge," he said. Virginia looked at the prairie stretching away to the north, at the sky that was already building its towering summer clouds, at the sunflowers and the fence line and the land that was irrevocably, documentably, joyfully hers. "I am glad you stayed," she said. James came careering back along the fence line at full speed and arrived breathless and delighted and wanting to know if there was breakfast. And Virginia and Nathan walked back toward the house with their son between them. And behind them the sunflowers continued their extravagant, golden agreement with the morning sun, and the flag of red calico had long since weathered into the sky. But the claim it marked was as solid and enduring as the earth it was planted in, the earth that had been fought for. Held by a woman who would not be moved, transformed by the work of two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and built into something that would last well. Beyond both of them and into the lives of the children they had given it to. The stake stood in the corner post. The land was theirs. The story was complete.